in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm a partnerships manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, hers, and hers. Today, I'm excited to welcome our next guest to the podcast, David Hanrahan. He is the Chief Human Resources Officer at Eventbrite. David, how's your day going?
Today is going well.
Good. Thanks for being on the show. If you could start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and how did you answer the question, what do you want to be when you grow up when you were younger?
That's great. Yeah. So my pronouns are he, him, his. Let's see. When I was younger, I wanted to be Indiana Jones. I thought all archaeologists, that was their job. So, but then as I grew a little bit older in junior high, I took one of those career tests, and it told me that I'm going to be a podiatrist, or that I should be a podiatrist. Didn't even know what that was. So naturally, I'm in HR now.
Yeah, fast forward to now, you're not Indiana Jones, but maybe the Indiana Jones of HR. How has your personal journey really led you to this point to kind of lead the HR team at Eventbrite?
Well, I've always been fascinated by human psychology, and I stumbled on HR when I took this industrial psychology class in undergrad, which was basically psychology of the workplace. And so there is this really long history of IO psych, and I got really interested in that, and that led me to studying HR after I left the University of Arizona. And I really started my HR career in these really slow-moving, heavily governed companies. I originally thought I wanted to do more labor relations stuff, which means working with unions, like between managers and unions, companies and unions, doing that type of work. But I think what I realized I had early in my HR career was a sort of an itch for more creative workplaces, creative environments, and that kind of led me to tech and software companies. Where I think there's really cool stuff going on around building, and in particular building cultures, building people practices, and you just find, or at least I found, that there was much more like kind of proclivity to innovate and experiment, even in the people space. And so as a creative person, that resonated for me, and I've been gravitated to companies, tech companies, where I can kind of like actually use the product. So EA, video games, Twitter, social media, and now Eventbrite is a company that's had this really strong history of progressive people practices. And Julia, the co-founder, and her team were one of the first software companies that adopted a really generous and equal parental leave program. I'm a parent. That really spoke to me. And as fate would have it, the live events industry, however, has been largely in hibernation during the pandemic. So I didn't anticipate that. I joined before that happened, but nonetheless, right now it's roaring back in some fortunate geographies where there's vaccines, like here in the U.S. And it's just kind of cool to be part of a platform that's going to be bringing humans back together in live experiences. And so that's a long answer to the question about the personal journey to Eventbrite.
I think context is important, so I appreciate the longer detailed answer as well. And there's certainly been a lot of opportunity to innovate and be a progressive people leader over the past year. And I have a bunch of questions around strategy, but the first I want to tackle is around this kind of virtual first environment for working at Eventbrite. I know at the beginning of the month, it was announced that employees can come in as many days a week as they want, or they can continue working remotely or from home if the flexibility is easier for them. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to that decision, and how you're thinking about rethinking collaboration in the future for company culture?
Yeah, you bet. This was something that we debated. I wish I could say that we knew this was the right thing to do a year ago when we were really having this conversation in the middle of the pandemic, or at the start of the pandemic, frankly. By working from home, eventually, we're going to have to decide, what do we do? Like, what does this look like, when the pandemic subsides? We were having this debate, a year ago. And, we came to this idea of flexibility and choice being this really powerful thing. We kept coming back to employee flexibility and choice. We don't want it to be that it's up to your manager to decide whether you need to come back to the office or not. It's up to you to decide what's best for you. And we think that trumps a belief that the office is best. And we think that employee flexibility and choice trumps a belief that, the kind of office is where work gets done. Some will be in the office, some are going to come back if it's best for them. Some will work remotely, like me. I work remotely. I'm in Austin right now, and some will come in occasionally, but it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to get this right from a cultural point of view, and so we have to reimagine work practices, right? I think it's easy for companies that are going to say everyone has to come back to work. It's much easier than, because everyone has the same experience. It's probably also equally easy for companies that say we're going to be fully remote. And because everyone's experience is a level playing field. When you've got, a given team that is just very randomly, like 4 of them are kind of coming to the office, 1 of them is kind of coming and going, 5 of them work remotely in different time zones, managing meetings becomes really difficult. So we have to kind of reimagine, meeting practices. Who starts the meeting? Do you book a room, going forward for a conference or for a meeting? All that stuff has to be reimagined. And what we're doing right now is we're having workshops. We are having focus groups internally. We have reopened a couple of our offices already. So we reopened Nashville as an example. I was just there for the reopening the other week. And from those reopenings, like first office and the next one and the next one, you kind of learn. You learn what works and what doesn't work. And it's going to be kind of iterative. And I think learning is kind of a key concept, in this sort of hybrid model that we're going forward with, and sharing best practices and learning from other companies. So, I think back to the question, how do we come to this decision? I think it's about believing that flexibility and choice is going to be a powerful thing for particularly the type of company we are, a software company. And I think we're right. We're right so far, knock on wood. I saw a stat the other day that upwards of 93% of job seekers right now are prioritizing this type of flexibility in the next workplace that they join. So, that's going to be positive for us. And it's just going to be a challenge to make sure we get the culture right, which, kind of goes back to your company values.
Absolutely. People are craving a lot of flexibility, and also they're asking more from their companies and employers and having a conversation right now, especially in today's talent market. I was reading the other day as well, similar statistics in terms of what people are looking for, especially as vaccines increase. And something else that folks are looking at for employees is mental health benefits and how companies are supporting, or proactively preventing burnout amongst their teams at the company at large. I know Eventbrite was one of the first of 200 plus organizations to celebrate Mental Health Action Day back in May. But how do you really think about, Eventbrite supporting the mental health of employees no matter where they are in the world?
Well, I think it starts with understanding what we're dealing with here. So, there's some very scary stats, but just to sort of kind of level set, college graduates today have a 3x suicide rate that of college graduates in the 50s. Mental health, mental illness incident rates of anxiety and depression, as an example, have just skyrocketed. Today, 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 adults experiences mental illness in a year. Oftentimes goes undiagnosed, but that's as common as the flu. And so it already was an epidemic before the pandemic. And now the pandemic has really exacerbated that, has exacerbated rates of anxiety and depression, and even greater rates for underrepresented populations. And so understanding that, you kind of know, this is a crisis. We have to think of it that way as a company. And it used to just be the case that companies could say, well, we have an EAP, or talk to your psychiatrist. That's why we have a HMO and PPO. And that's not the case anymore. I think you have to take a proactive approach. And so that's a sort of level setting. And so during the pandemic, we've had a lot of fireside conversations on mental health. I think it starts your organization set the tone, right? Leaders set a tone. Is this a taboo subject? Do leaders care? Are they going to talk about it? So I've personally facilitated fireside chats and talked about it, and talked about me struggling. When you hear a leader talk about it, suddenly it's it's okay to not be okay. And that's a phrase that we have. It's okay to not be okay. We talk about that. We talk about the importance of taking time off and avoiding burnout. We had an internal fireside chat, a series that one of our engineering leaders, Nick, came up with called Burnout Bright Camp. And it was just recognizing burnout, talking about this. What should you do for yourself? What do others do? People kind of they open up and they share the stuff. And so we've also done something, we came up with a pilot in the pandemic called Bright Breaks, which was just an idea like, hey, what if we all just had the first Friday of every month during the pandemic, we take that off just to recharge, just to like for everyone, we're all gonna take that day to take care of ourselves. That wound up working really well compared to things that we experiment with, like sort of calendar blocks, like sort of like blocking time off. It worked really well, and so we decided to commit to that going forward now. So now it's a program that we just have at Eventbrite. First Friday every month, we all take it off, and universally loved. And people have shared stories about like swimming in the North Sea and sort of reconnecting with their family. And there's something powerful when the whole company is doing it on a day that usually was reserved for work. It just resets your whole frame of mind. So that was one thing, on mental health and the pandemic. And we've also had a Modern Health, which is a mental health on-demand platform. We've had that in place now for a while, and during the pandemic, we doubled the therapy benefit that employees have access to. So those are a few things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the best gifts you can give someone is time. And when everybody takes time off together and nobody is slacking you or emailing you, I think it just makes a difference to recharge as well. And hearing those stories, I think reemphasizes that too. Getting kind of more specific in terms of your employee population, you mentioned that you're a dad as well, and I'm sure that there are other caretakers in every sense of the word in terms of if they're taking care of older parents or family members, newborns, teenagers, what have you. And it's been a major kind of topic of conversation and something that is important to Eventbrite as well. What role do you see companies playing in actively supporting employees who identify as caretakers? What is really kind of helpful for them in terms of benefits or just long-term strategies for support?
Yeah, being a caretaker is very common, right? And sometimes people have dual caretaking responsibilities. They've got a child, a young child, who they're caretaking for, and like, gosh, how hard was that to do in the pandemic? Particularly if your schools were closed, like where I lived. My child's school was closed throughout the whole pandemic. So parenting on Zoom and sort of being a teacher, on Zoom and trying to work full time was super hard. And so that became really loud and clear early on in the pandemic that we were going to have to shift things around and tell employees, take care of yourself first. Put your own air mask on first if you've got the situation with the school thing. And we had we experimented with things. We had this thing called Virtual Babysitter Club, which is a company I think based in New York, and it was on Good Morning America. We tried that experimenting. So back to the whole iterative thing, experimenting with things and telling our parents in particular that, listen, like, we know this is hard. Like, you tell us what you need to do, and like, we have a policy of take the time you need. Take the time for yourself, whether that is blocking calendar time off to sort of be with your family, take care of your child's school stuff. I have an elderly parent. I had to go home, during the pandemic to help. So back to your point, companies have to like embrace this, that like caretaking is its own job. So we think of ourselves, as leaders oftentimes like, well, you've got your job at work, but actually many of us have multiple jobs. Caretaking in particular is a big one. And so I just actually had a conversation with a set of parents internally while I was in Nashville. We had a little parents focus group. For parents, it goes beyond just having the parental leave. It has the processes to help employees come back from leave. So thinking more holistically beyond just like you have got a great parental leave program. They want to have flexibility to come back, to be able to choose, part-time work for them potentially, adjust their schedules. And so having this sort of infrastructure and these policies in place becomes really important. I'll just comment really quickly that we've been part of a sign on to a letter from the Paid Leave US campaign to fight for paid leave in the United States. That's currently being debated in Congress, and we were a co-signer of that open letter because we're really passionate about this. But it goes beyond parental leave for caretaking. I think a big thing in the future that that employers are going to have to grapple with is elder care. I've been advising a company called Grace that is really doing some really cool work in this space around being able to match people who are struggling with caretaking, in particular elder care, with licensed gerontologists who can help through the caretaking journey. And I think this is going to be a big one for employers to grapple with, because pretty soon the elderly population is going to eclipse the child population in the United States. So employers, get ready for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that is going to be very important over the next few years as well. And as you mentioned, people have different jobs, different hats that they're wearing in their personal and professional lives. It's a work-life blend. And I wanted to ask your opinion in terms of, we hear a lot about love what you do. In order to do great work, you have to love your job and have that passion. Do you think that, for the future work that we're seeing, that it's really important to love your job to do great work at the company?
That's a really good question. I think, if you're to kind of think about it from a Daniel Pink mentality, people find jobs, they gravitate towards work that they can master, that gives them purpose, and they can do it autonomously, ideally. And so whether that means you love your job, or you're mastering, you're mastering your job, you have autonomy, you have purpose. I think the purpose part is going to be really important, to sort of see the importance of what you're doing. If you can see the importance of the work that you're doing, you can connect that somehow to something, a higher purpose. I think that's powerful. And whether or not that's love, is TBD. I kind of think right now during the pandemic, obviously we're kind of in this like great resignation sort of, kind of wave is what people are talking about. I think a lot of people have done some reflecting on whether they actually want to work, as much as they've been working, whether the job that they've been doing, is what they, want to continue to do. And I think that reflection is probably, for some people, whether they love the job or whether they have, they see the purpose in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's incredibly right. There's a lot of time to reflect and think over this past year, and what you want to pour 40 to 60 hours of your life doing. And some people have found that by pivoting or moving jobs as well. And I also wanted to ask around this emergence of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's obviously, that's not a new thing, but a lot of people are reinvigorating their strategies and thinking about how to make sure that their company is a really inclusive place. How is Eventbrite thinking about making sure that the workplace is equitable? And also wanted to ask, in terms of last year, in addition to the pandemic, we saw a huge corporate social justice movement happening with anti-racism. How did Eventbrite really kind of respond to that as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. Speaking of reflection, I think a lot of companies are probably doing a lot of reflecting last summer around, are we doing enough? Are we doing the right thing? And I don't think Eventbrite was quote unquote doing the right thing. I don't think we were doing great by any means on anything diversity, equity, or inclusion. So what we did was we sat down and reflected as leaders, and we started to think about new commitments, new things that we should take action on, tangible commitments. And we talked about it with our Black employee group called Black and Bright. And we came up with tangible commitments. And I think the key thing for us was these are going to be leadership commitments to diversity, equity, inclusion. This is not the HR teams, this is not their thing. We're not delegating it. I think we had probably in the past done a little bit of that delegation, and that's why we weren't effective. It was first and foremost, these are going to be leadership commitments. We're going to own them. And we made sure that the types of commitments that the tangible actions we were taking under the commitments were things that we could own, as opposed to like, well, that's outsourced to the X team. And so those commitments cut across hiring, diversifying our workforce, fostering greater inclusion, and supporting social impact. And specific actions under each of those. So an example would be our community time off policy that we came up with for the support the social impact, that someone in our social impact team named Drew really launched and was a big part of the social impact part of our commitments. So the work here is never done, but I guess I'll just say that, in the past few quarters in a row, we've increased the percentage of our underrepresented workforce relative to the majority workforce. Our underrepresented workforce and female staff are as engaged or more so than the majority workforce, which oftentimes in tech you see like the underrepresented workforce, their engagement is much lower than the majority workforce. And we're promoting and retaining underrepresented Brightlings at greater rates, equal or greater rates than majority counterparts. So something is working there, but it's never over. Like the next quarter could be the opposite story. But it goes back to the execs owning the DEI efforts. I think if we can continue doing it that way, where the leaders own them and the leaders are on the spotlight on their own data, like they feel like, hey, they have the urgency to make this, to make progress here, then I think any company will have a little bit better time at this than if they outsource it somehow.
Yeah, and you're talking about leadership commitments in terms of responsibility, accountability, and ownership there. Do you think executives have a different role to play in corporate social justice and just their role and voice just in these types of projects in general?
Well, employees, right? People entering the workforce now in particular. So millennials and Gen Z, those graduating college and entering the workforce right now, they want to see their company prioritizing this, right? And so there are certainly companies in the news more recently where they've said, we're going to ban conversations on this at work. And that sends a strong signal, right? That people, you're not going to see a lot of progress. That's the signal. And so it's hard work. And what we know is that the generation entering the workforce now and really the majority of your employees, they want to see companies prioritize this stuff. They want to see it because they want to see themselves represented. We all have differences, and our underrepresented workforce, they see themselves, they see it, they see their differences. And if they don't see the companies prioritizing this, they'll go elsewhere. And so I think that's important to see you represented at the company and that the company care about, in particular, social impact. Eventbrite as a platform, it has social impact happening on the platform. I went to a protest that I found on Eventbrite last summer. And so I think it's kind of in our blood. And so for us, it's a high priority.
Yeah, and when you're reflecting on your leadership and your role as one of the chief executives at the company as well, when you're thinking about measuring your own progress too, so not just with diversity, equity, and inclusion, but at a larger scale for effective leadership, what do you really kind of look to? Of course, there's the qualitative data for just feedback that you're getting, but how do you know that you are leading effectively?
Well, quantitatively, we can use various tools, like we use Culture Amp, and a lot of companies have these tools where you can measure sentiment in your workforce. And one cool thing about the tool that we use is it shows you what's statistically significant in terms of factors that go into employee engagement, which translates to people unlocking their potential and really great innovations at your workplace. We can see what those factors are, and under leadership, we can see it as an example. One example is, my manager has communicated how my performance is evaluated. And so we've created this leadership factor that's an aggregate of questions that we see that have a statistical significant impact on employee engagement, and particularly that the managers can own that, like, this is not the company, this is them, what they're doing. And so we do that. We measure that quarterly, and also measure it annually, like a big version of it. And I think a lot of it just goes into communication. And so, like, how managers are communicating effectively with their staff? You see effective leadership really happening when you see effective communication happening.
Yeah, and effective communication includes, empathetic listening and actioning as well. And you can really tell when someone is being authentic and genuine about that too. So I think that is really important. And I think we're seeing so many people innovate the way they are doing transparent communication, the employee experience, and their HR and people strategies in general. But of course, when you're iterating and when you are kind of trying things out for the first time, mistakes are bound to happen. And, there's that quote, when you know better, you do better. So not necessarily at Eventbrite, but it can be. Are you seeing any kind of other mistakes that companies or individuals are making, whether they had the best intentions or not, but they essentially just fell flat?
Well, on the topic of trust, I can't take credit for this quote. I'm going to butcher the quote, but trust is fuel for high performance, right? So when you trust, you can move really quickly, and people are unencumbered, right, by their own company bureaucracy or, their manager meddling with them. Like when you have a talented workforce and you trust them, you see this high performance really take off. And so mistakes, what are companies doing that as far as mistakes? I think it's about not trusting. So, in my view, when we say that we're going to let our employees choose the sort of working approach that's best for them, that's inherently a trust thing, right? And so when the company says, well, we don't trust you to, to work, effectively without being in the office. So you got to come in the office 3 days a week, or you got to come in on the day that I say. That's the opposite of trust. And I don't see how that yields high performance. And there are a lot of big companies that are doing that for whatever reason. Maybe they feel like they have to, but in any case, I think that's a mistake if you can avoid it.
Yeah, I think building trust is not only a nice to have, but a need to have in terms of performance as well. And I think it's along the similar lines of having diverse teams as well. It just produces a better product and workplace for everyone and a better mindset. I guess the opposite of that question is, are there any, positive trends that you're seeing in the industry that individuals and companies need to hone in on to be successful in the future and really implement that into their strategy?
Yeah, I mentioned, I think elder care and mental health are probably two that have been written about now that are certainly important trends for HR teams to really take sort of proactive, progressive approaches on. But one I think is kind of interesting. I think is a positive. It's a positive thing in my view, but I think it will be looked at as somewhat big brotherish. Is with new sort of text analytics tools and advances in text analytics and sort of like understanding semantics and language, like through AI, all of this conversation that we have going on over IMs and emails and meetings, like we have all these meetings that are happening across a company. There's going to be tools that can figure out how to assess that, whether your company is being effective with the sheer amount of meetings that they're having. Or we're spotting something, we're spotting a problem. There's these same day meetings being scheduled, in the XYZ team, in the ABC office, and there's something here that feels wrong, and we should highlight that to the leader to sort of take a look at this. I think that's exciting. I think that's cool that we're going to have AI that helps understand really workplace productivity and like how we can just be better at our jobs by allowing AI to understand, in aggregate, not at the individual level, in aggregate, the conversations that we're having and what's ineffective and where's the tension happening. Because I think that's important because, doing the sort of quarterly or annual engagement thing is not real time, right? That's not real time understanding of what's going on in your organization. Real time is what's happening is all the conversations that we have. It's kind of big brotherish. And I can see how people would say, oh, that's kind of scary. But at the same time, I think it's kind of exciting if we can use that for good and help people just be better at what they do and unlock their potential.
There's a way to use kind of technology to do that and also see the data behind it and science to make the workplace better for everyone too, and keep an ear to the ground. If you're not getting feedback, that doesn't mean everything is great and well. Things are happening all the time and people have opinions too. And I know that you've had 19 plus years of experience in the industry, not only at Eventbrite, but other large companies. And I wanted to ask, from your opinion, have you seen the role of HR or kind of the stereotype around HR change during that time in a positive way, or how have you seen that changed, if at all?
It's a good question. I think if I was to really zoom out, there certainly has been a decade by decade change in HR. I mean, it used to be called the personnel department, right? And now it's going from human resources to the people function. Or, in our case, we call it the Breitling experience, or some companies call it the employee experience, which I think is great. And it's kind of its language. But what practically, how is HR changing? I think when it's changing for the good, it's HR being a value driver, right? It's being a problem solver, understanding what the business is trying to do and connecting the people strategy to the business strategy. That is a sort of a solution driving approach, as opposed to maybe a traditional HR team being hey, we react to problems. We solve your ER issues, we pay people in the pay cycle, we run these performance processes. And that's low value add. But high value add is connecting a people strategy to business strategy and helping make sure that the talent that we have. So culture, quote unquote culture, the culture and the talent that we have deliver on the business plan. And thinking of it that way, I think feels like a development for the good, where those HR teams are actually doing that.
Yeah, I think that HR, or the people function, as you mentioned as well, has a really big seat at the table to make a difference, especially right now. So I definitely see that as well. I wanted to ask a couple of, as we're nearing the end of our conversation, a couple of personal questions based on your experience too. I mean, we talked about innovating and learning, being creative over this past year and beyond, and trusting employees. When was the last like learning moment that you had, whether it was at Eventbrite or elsewhere?
It's going to sound kind of arcane or obscure, but well, my last learning moment was learning about Black-Scholes, which is an option pricing formula, and the inputs into Black-Scholes, which include something called volatility. And what is volatility? So it's kind of it seems like a simple one or a small one or very arcane, but I think for me, what's wrapped up in that is understanding executive compensation and boards and like the dynamics at that level. Like as I've grown in my career, I've just realized how important it is to spend time thinking about that, exec comp and boards and all that sort of stuff. And so that's been an ongoing learning for me more recently in my career. And so that's my take on that one.
Yeah, definitely a wonky word there, but definitely important to understand the structure there and just like compensation in that regard as well. And then I'm sure a lot of people would look at your career and say, okay, like, David has all the answers, he knows what he's doing, but what still keeps you up at night?
Well, it's I alluded to this earlier, but the culture disruption that we're about to embark on, where for us we're going to embrace hybrid working. We used to be an in-office culture. So Eventbrite, 97% of our workforce worked in an office and spent the majority of their week in the office. And going forward, probably 20, maybe 20, 30% of our workforce will be in the office regularly. The vast majority will just kind of be in there infrequently or not at all. And that's different, by the way, than what we're currently doing, where everyone is working from home, or at least they were before we started opening offices. But how your culture adapts in a positive way to that keeps me up at night, because it's going to be hard to sort of, facilitate a culture with that sort of like those like highly different experiences, by employee. That keeps me up at night.
Yeah. I mean, it's a large question, and it's something that is very heavy on the shoulders of a lot of folks right now. So that definitely makes sense. What is the last or the most recent Eventbrite event you've attended?
Ooh, let's see. Well, I attended our reopening. That wasn't on the Eventbrite platform. A reopening in Nashville, the Nashville office. So I did a lot of things in the pandemic over Zoom on Eventbrite, cooking class. There was comedy shows at drive-in movie theaters, a lot of like really creative things. And so it was probably one of those. And now, this live experience, I'm kind of looking forward to the live, like with people experience next.
With people in real life. I love it. I use Eventbrite a lot here in Brooklyn to find great comedy shows. So had to ask you that as well. Is there anything else that I didn't ask, or just one or two key takeaways that you want to emphasize for our listeners before we close out our conversation?
I was thinking about that question, and I've heard people talk about the return to normal. And I don't think there is a return to normal. So if you hear people say that we're returning to normal, we're plunging headfirst into the future, and it's not going back in any way to kind of what it was before the pandemic. And nor do we know what the future will be like. And I think it's there's a lot of clickbait articles around sort of like the future of work, future of HR, whatever. No one knows what the future is. So if you read those articles, take that with a big grain of salt, because I think what the future is really just living in the moment. Like the future is now. The future is like the conversation that we are having. Like that's the future. And like spend time living in the present, thinking about now and iterating on that, rather than like worrying about what will come next. And I should take that, my own advice there, is a takeaway I think I'd leave with people.
Yeah, all we have is right now we can just be proactive and, you know, be agile and versatile to all the uncertainty that's going to come. Because I think if this last year has taught us anything, is that a lot of things are not in our control that we once thought, but we can always, you know, again, be proactive. With that, David, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, of course. And as a reminder for our listeners, AllVoices believes in the empowerment of everyone to speak up, and we think it's a requirement for the company to succeed. We'll speak soon.